My name is Rachel, and for most of my life, I was the dependable one. If my younger sister Catherine needed help with rent, I helped. If mom couldn't cover a bill, I covered it. Birthdays, holidays, emergencies, unexpected expenses, I was usually the first person everyone called. Because they knew I'd find a way to make things work. It wasn't because I had endless money. I worked long shifts as a pediatric ICU nurse, often leaving before sunrise and getting home long after dark. I simply believed that family looked after one another. For years, I never questioned whether that care was flowing both ways. Then Daniel died. My husband was killed in a helicopter accident when our son Tommy was only 4 years old. Overnight, our world became divided into two parts: life before the phone call and life after it. There isn't a manual for explaining death to a little boy who still waits by the window because he thinks his dad might come home, if he waits long enough. There also isn't a manual for rebuilding a child's sense of safety after everything familiar has been ripped away. So we built our own. Tommy's bedroom slowly became that safe place. His father had painted the walls with him one weekend, laughing because more paint ended up on themselves than on the walls. Together they'd built a small wooden bookshelf that leaned slightly to one side, because Daniel insisted crooked shelves had more personality than perfect ones. On one shelf sat a wooden sailboat they had started building together before the accident. Daniel never got the chance to finish it. Neither did Tommy. Every night before bed, Tommy would dust it carefully and whisper, "We'll finish it someday, Dad." That unfinished boat meant more to him than anything money could buy. Our annual weekend trip had become another tradition after Daniel passed away. Every summer, Tommy and I disappeared for 2 quiet days without phones, work, or distractions. We stayed at the same small lakeside cabin, skipped rocks across the water, roasted marshmallows, and talked about Daniel. It wasn't about forgetting him. It was about remembering him without feeling crushed by the memories. This year felt different. Tommy laughed more than he had in months. On the drive home, he talked nonstop about where he wanted to place the polished stones he'd collected. He already knew exactly which shelf they would go on beside the sailboat. He couldn't wait to get home. Neither could I. As we pulled into the driveway, I noticed a few unfamiliar tire tracks near the curb. At first, I didn't think much of it. My mother had been checking on the house while we were away, and Catherine often stopped by without calling. I unlocked the front door, expecting the familiar smell of home. Instead, something felt strangely hollow. The hallway echoed. A framed family photo that normally hung near the entrance was missing. The small table beneath it had been pushed against the wall. I frowned, assuming someone had moved things while cleaning. Tommy was already racing toward his bedroom, excited to unpack his treasures. A second later, everything changed. His footsteps stopped. The silence that followed lasted only a few seconds. But I would remember those few seconds for the rest of my life. I hurried down the hallway, already knowing something was wrong before I reached Tommy's door. He stood frozen in the middle of the doorway, his little backpack still hanging from one shoulder. His eyes slowly scanned the room from one empty corner to the other. There wasn't a bed. There wasn't a dresser. The bookshelf Daniel had built was gone. The toy chest was gone. The desk where Tommy drew pictures for his dad was gone. Even the curtains had been taken down. The room echoed when I stepped inside. It didn't look like someone had cleaned it. It looked like someone had erased it. Tommy finally looked at me, completely confused. "Mom, where's my room?" I didn't have an answer. Before I could even begin to process what I was seeing, I heard footsteps behind us. Catherine walked into the hallway carrying a cup of coffee, smiling like she'd been waiting for us to arrive. "Oh good," she said cheerfully. "You're finally home." I stared at her. What happened to his room? She blinked like the question surprised her. "I emptied it." My stomach tightened. "What do you mean, you emptied it?" She shrugged without the slightest hint of guilt. "I needed a nursery. You guys were gone for the weekend, so Mom let me use the room. I sold most of the furniture online. Honestly, I got a really good price." She actually sounded proud of herself. For a moment, I wondered if I had misunderstood her. "You sold it?" Yeah, she replied with a laugh. People bought almost everything the same day. Turns out vintage furniture is worth way more than I thought. I felt Tommy move closer until he was pressed against my side. What about his things? I asked quietly. The boxes? The keepsakes? The photographs? The toys? The sailboat? Catherine waved her hand dismissively. Oh, some of that stuff sold too. The rest was just clutter. Tommy's young. He'll get over it. Every word landed harder than the last. Just then Mom stepped into the hallway. Instead of looking shocked, she looked annoyed. I already explained everything to Catherine, she said. She and the baby need the space more than Tommy does. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. This is Tommy's room. It was, Mom corrected. But families make sacrifices. Catherine has a baby coming. You have the money to replace anything important. Replace it. As though memories could be ordered online. As though the little sailboat Daniel had carved with his own hands could simply be bought again. Tommy quietly slipped his hand into mine. His fingers were trembling. He wasn't asking about the furniture anymore. He was looking around the empty room, searching for pieces of his father that no longer existed. Did they take Dad's boat? He whispered. I couldn't answer, because I already knew they had. For the first time since Daniel died. I saw the same lost expression on Tommy's face that I'd seen at his father's funeral. Catherine noticed neither of us was speaking. She rolled her eyes. Oh, come on. You're acting like I robbed a museum. Then she laughed. I even sold that little wooden boat. Some collector paid way more than I expected. That sentence settled over the room like ice. Tommy buried his face against my arm. I wrapped one arm around him while forcing myself to stay perfectly still. Getting angry wouldn't bring anything back. Yelling wouldn't help Tommy. And arguing with people who genuinely believed they'd done nothing wrong would only give them another chance to justify it. So instead, I looked around the empty room one last time. The outlines of the missing furniture were still visible in the carpet. A few tiny scratches marked the wall where Daniel's bookshelf had once stood. One forgotten screw rested beneath the window. Someone in a hurry always leaves something behind. I took out my phone. Without saying another word, I started taking photographs. Every empty wall. Every missing fixture. Every corner of the room. Catherine laughed again. Oh, are you making memories now? I looked at her for the first time since she'd admitted everything. No, I said calmly. I'm making a record. She smiled like that answer was ridiculous. What she didn't realize was that from that moment forward, I had stopped arguing as a sister. I had started documenting as the legal owner. And those are two very different things. Rachel always said the hardest part wasn't discovering what Catherine had done. It was resisting the urge to fight about it. Every instinct told me to argue. To demand answers. To force my mother to admit how wrong this was. But I'd spent enough years trying to reason with people who always believed they were entitled to more than they had earned. Another argument wasn't going to change anything. Evidence might. That night, after Tommy finally fell asleep in the guest room, I sat at my kitchen table with a notebook, my laptop, and a cup of coffee that went cold long before I noticed. I started with the easiest question. Where had everything gone? Catherine had practically answered that herself. She'd sold it online. She'd even bragged about getting a good price. People who think they've done nothing wrong rarely bother covering their tracks. Within 20 minutes, I found the first listing. The bookshelf Daniel had built. The photographs showed every scratch and every uneven shelf that I could have recognized from anywhere. Catherine had written, solid handmade wooden bookshelf. Great condition. Pickup only. The listing showed it had already sold. I saved screenshots. Then I found Tommy's desk, his toy chest, his reading chair, the vintage dresser that had belonged to Daniel's grandmother. One by one, every missing item appeared. Each listing included photographs, descriptions, sale prices, timestamps. Some even showed Catherine's profile picture. She had unknowingly built the beginning of my evidence file herself. I downloaded every image before any listing could disappear. Then I opened the digital inventory I'd created years earlier for our homeowner's insurance. Working in pediatric intensive care had taught me that memories fade under stress, but records don't. After Daniel died, I documented nearly everything valuable in the house. Furniture, electronics, jewelry, family heirlooms, even sentimental items. Not because I expected this. Because insurance companies ask detailed questions after disasters. Now that habit became invaluable. Every serial number, every receipt, every photograph, every appraisal, everything matched. The sailboat wasn't financially valuable, but I had dozens of pictures showing Daniel building it with Tommy. There were birthday photos, holiday photos, videos. Even one clip where Daniel joked that they'd finish it together before Tommy turned 10. Watching that video almost broke me. I closed my laptop before emotion could distract me. There would be time to grieve later. Right now, I needed facts. The following morning, I began contacting buyers. Not to accuse them. Not to demand anything. Simply to explain that the property had been sold without the owner's permission. And that law enforcement would likely contact them. Most people were stunned. Several voluntarily shared screenshots of their conversations with Catherine. One buyer apologized repeatedly after learning the truth. Another still had the furniture in storage and agreed not to move or alter it until the ownership issue was resolved. Every polite conversation produced another document, another screenshot, another receipt, another timestamp. By the end of the second day, my evidence binder had grown thicker than I expected. Meanwhile, my phone wouldn't stop ringing. Mom called first. "You've made your point," she said. Catherine said she's sorry. "No," I answered calmly. "She said she got a good price." Silence. Then came the familiar argument. Families forgive each other. "I do forgive people," I replied. "I don't erase what happened." An hour later, Catherine called. She sounded irritated more than worried. "I heard you're contacting people who bought my stuff. It wasn't your property." "Oh my gosh, Rachel. You're seriously embarrassing the family over furniture." I looked at the growing stack of printed records beside me. It stopped being about furniture the moment you sold things that belonged to my son. She laughed. "Nobody's going to arrest a pregnant woman over this." "I haven't asked anyone to arrest anyone. I've simply reported what happened." She sighed dramatically. "You always make everything so complicated." That sentence stayed with me after the call ended. Because from Catherine's perspective, documentation probably did seem complicated. She had spent her whole life assuming confidence was enough. That people would accept whatever explanation sounded most convincing. Unfortunately for her, paperwork doesn't care who sounds convincing. It only cares what's true. 3 days later, I organized everything into labeled sections. Property inventory, purchase receipts, insurance records, photographs, marketplace listings, buyer communications, messages from Catherine, messages from Mom, timeline of events, ownership documentation. When I finally closed the binder, it no longer looked like a family disagreement. It looked exactly like what it was. A complete record of someone believing that being related to another person gave them permission to sell property that was never theirs. For the first time since opening Tommy's empty bedroom door, I felt something other than heartbreak. Not relief. Not happiness. Certainty. Because the story my family was telling everyone depended on emotion. The story inside that binder depended on evidence. And evidence has a way of speaking much louder than excuses ever can. The detective didn't begin our meeting by asking how angry I was. He asked for documentation. That was the moment I knew I had made the right decision. I placed the evidence binder on the desk and slid it toward him. Inside were photographs of Tommy's room before and after we left for our trip. Insurance records identifying the missing property, receipts, screenshots of online listings, conversations with buyers, and a timeline showing exactly when each item had been listed and sold. He spent several minutes turning pages without interrupting. Occasionally, he stopped to compare 2 photographs or make a note beside a printed screenshot. Finally, he closed the binder. "You've organized this exceptionally well," he said. I wanted to make sure nothing was missing. He nodded. It shows. There was no dramatic reaction. No instant declaration that someone was going to jail. Real investigations don't work that way. Instead, he explained what would happen next. The ownership of the property had to be verified. The online listings would be preserved. Statements would be collected. The buyers would be contacted. Every claim would need supporting evidence before any decision could be made. It was slower than television, but it was real. Over the next several days, I received occasional updates as investigators confirmed details that were already inside the binder. Several buyers willingly cooperated. Some still had the items. Others provided payment records, message histories, and pickup times. Every interview strengthened the timeline. Every verified transaction removed another possible excuse. Meanwhile, Catherine continued behaving as though none of this could possibly affect her. She posted cheerful pregnancy updates online. She joked with relatives about how dramatic I was being over old furniture. According to family members, she kept insisting everything would disappear the moment someone reminded the police that we were sisters. She genuinely believed the relationship mattered more than the evidence. Mom believed the same thing. She came to my house one evening carrying a casserole, as though a homemade dinner could somehow replace everything Tommy had lost. "Sweetheart," she said gently, "this has gone far enough." "I don't think it has. Catherine is under so much stress. So is Tommy. She's about to become a mother. And I'm already one." She sighed. "You know what I mean." I did. For years, our family had operated under the same unwritten rule. Catherine's problems became everyone else's responsibility. My problems became mine alone. That arrangement had survived because I kept accepting it. Now it was colliding with something it couldn't negotiate with. Facts. Mom sat quietly for a moment before speaking again. "What if Catherine pays you back?" "This isn't a store return. It was a mistake." It stopped being a mistake when she advertised the items, accepted payment, and laughed about selling Tommy's memories. Mom lowered her eyes. "I just don't want this tearing the family apart." I looked toward the hallway where Tommy was, quietly rebuilding a small puzzle at the dining table. It already did. A week later, the detective called again. Most of the property had now been traced. Several items had already been recovered. Others had been identified through buyer statements even if they had changed hands again. The unfinished sailboat remained missing. That was the only item Tommy asked about every single day. Each evening, he would quietly ask the same question. "Did they find Dad's boat?" Each evening, I answered honestly, "Not yet." He always nodded. Then he would smile anyway. "We'll keep looking." His faith reminded me why I couldn't give in to the pressure around me. This case had never been about revenge. It had never even been about money. It was about teaching my son something Daniel had always believed. Doing the right thing isn't measured by whether it's easy. It's measured by whether you keep doing it when everyone else wants you to stop. As the investigation moved forward, the phone calls from relatives became more desperate. Some begged me to forgive. Others warned that pressing forward would permanently damage family relationships. One aunt quietly admitted she thought Catherine had gone too far, but still hoped I would be the bigger person. I thanked every one of them for sharing their opinion. Then I continued doing exactly what I'd been doing from the beginning. Nothing more. Nothing less. Answering questions. Providing records. Telling the truth. Eventually, the detective called with the update Catherine had insisted would never happen. After reviewing the documentation, verifying ownership, and completing witness interviews, the case would move forward through the legal system. No family meeting could change that. No emotional appeal could erase the records. No amount of pressure could rewrite the documented timeline. For the first time since Catherine proudly announced she'd gotten a good price, someone completely outside our family had reached the same conclusion I had. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a matter of accountability. And accountability had finally caught up with her. The months leading up to the hearing were surprisingly quiet. Not because the situation had improved. Because there was nothing left for anyone to argue about. Every conversation eventually reached the same dead end. The evidence hadn't changed. No new explanation could erase screenshots, receipts, buyer statements, or ownership records. For the first time in years, my family's opinions carried less weight than documented facts. When the case finally reached court, Catherine looked nothing like the confident woman who had laughed in Tommy's empty bedroom. She avoided looking at me. She avoided looking at Tommy. Most of all, she avoided looking at the evidence that had brought her there. The prosecution didn't need dramatic speeches. They simply presented the timeline. Photographs of Tommy's bedroom before we left. Photographs of the empty room after we returned. Online listings matching our property. Payment records. Buyer testimony. Insurance documentation. Messages in which Catherine openly admitted selling the items. Because she believed she had every right to do so. One piece at a time, the story she'd spent months defending quietly collapsed. The courtroom wasn't filled with shouting. It was filled with silence. The kind of silence that settles over a room when there are no reasonable arguments left. At one point, Catherine's attorney explored possible alternatives to a lengthy trial. That discussion eventually led to a proposed agreement acknowledging responsibility for what had happened. It also included restitution for the property that could not be recovered. Later, another request reached me through the attorneys. A letter asking whether I would support additional leniency. I read it carefully. Then I placed it back on the table. Months earlier, everyone had expected me to protect Catherine from the consequences of her own decisions. Nothing had changed except the setting. The expectation was exactly the same. Only this time it arrived on legal stationery instead of through family phone calls. I politely declined. Not because I wanted revenge. Because accountability only means something if it isn't abandoned the moment it becomes uncomfortable. The legal process continued. Ultimately, Catherine accepted responsibility through a guilty plea. Restitution was ordered for the property that couldn't be recovered. Several belongings had already been returned by honest buyers who immediately cooperated after learning the truth. Others were gone forever. No court could undo that. No judgment could recreate memories that had already been interrupted. But it could acknowledge that what happened was wrong. For Tommy, that mattered more than I realized. A few weeks after everything concluded, one of the investigators called with unexpected news. The unfinished wooden sailboat had finally been located. A buyer had recognized it from the case and voluntarily turned it over. When I placed it on our kitchen table, Tommy stood perfectly still. He ran one small hand across the unfinished wood exactly the way his father used to. For several seconds, he didn't say anything. Then he smiled. "We can finish it now." I nodded. "I think your dad would like that." That weekend we sat together in the garage with sandpaper, paint, and tiny brushes. Neither of us was trying to recreate the past. We were simply continuing something love had started years earlier. The sailboat would never be exactly the same. Neither would we. But unfinished doesn't mean broken. Sometimes it simply means someone else gets to carry the work forward. Life slowly settled into a different rhythm after that. My mother eventually moved out. Not because I forced her. Because the boundaries I'd finally established left no room for the old expectations. For the first time in my adult life, helping family became a choice instead of an obligation. The constant pressure disappeared. The guilt stopped working. The cycle finally ended. One evening, months later, Tommy stood in the doorway of his rebuilt bedroom. Most of the furniture was different. Some treasured items had been recovered. Others had been lovingly replaced. The sailboat rested on a new shelf where the afternoon sunlight reached it every day. Tommy looked around for a long moment before turning toward me. "It feels like home again," he said. Those 5 words were worth more than every dollar listed in the restitution order. Because that had always been the real victory. Not winning a legal case. Not proving anyone wrong. Simply giving my son back the feeling that what belonged to him could not be taken away without someone standing up for him. Looking back now, I don't remember Catherine's laughter as clearly as I once did. I remember something much more important. The moment I stopped trying to keep peace with people who demanded endless sacrifice and started protecting the child who depended on me most. Documentation didn't save our family. Boundaries did. And sometimes the most loving thing a parent can teach a child is that kindness never requires surrendering what is rightfully theirs.